Good evening and welcome to the Drive at 5 on IntellectualRadio.com/iHeart radio station. I'm your host, Roman, and we have a great show planned for you today. But first, the forecast from our IntellectualRadio.com Weather Center today. Some sunshine giving way to clouds, windy and warmer, and with a couple of showers here and there. High 57 degrees. Tonight, mostly cloudy, breezy, and chilly with a passing shower here and there again. Low 43 degrees. Tomorrow, mostly cloudy and increasing windy skies and windy all over the place. That's why they call it the Windy City. High 53 degrees. Tomorrow night, partly cloudy and chilly, low 41 degrees. The rest of the week forecast looks like this. Wednesday, cool with sun and clouds, high 55 degrees. Thursday, partly sunny and breezy, high 55 degrees again. And on Friday, very windy. There is going to be a wind advisory, but it's going to be sunny outside, high 51 degrees. And I heard a little birdie told me that 60s might be in the forecast on Saturday, but don't count on it. The Drive at 5 is also part of the Monday Night Mogul with One Sister to Another with your girl Angela Johnson at 4 p.m. Straight No Chaser with Real Ray Harris at 6 p.m. New Black Leadership at 7 p.m. Maze Says with Maze Jackson at 8 p.m. The Drive at 5 is also part of the fabulous 5 at 5, only on IntellectualRadio.com. Today, my guests are community leaders that tackle many issues, including education. Welcome back to The Drive. Community leader to my left, Ron Lawless, and CEO of College Mentoring Experience, Bernard Lilly Sr. Welcome back to The Drive, guys.
Thank you so much. Hey, thanks. It's a pleasure.
There's a lot of issues that's concerning education, so let's get right to it. You are very concerned about education funding in Illinois and how they disperse money, especially in the African-American community. Why should we be concerned?
Well, you're a taxpayer, and as a taxpayer, you should get your money, representation. You pay taxes, you should get representation. One of the biggest problems we face here in the city of Chicago is that the city of Chicago has 20% of the population, but only receives 15% of the revenues from the state to fund education. It is the responsibility of the state of Illinois, not the city of Chicago or the mayor of Chicago, to fund education. People seem to get that misconstrued. It is the responsibility under the Constitution of the state of Illinois that Illinois is responsible for funding public education, and it is to do it fairly and equitably.
And you saying not the mayor?
No, the mayor's responsibility is the mayor of the city of Chicago. It is the Constitution of the state of Illinois for funding of education to be done by the state of Illinois, not by the mayor of Chicago. The mayor of Chicago does like any other community. He may find monies to plug in holes where the state is not funding, in this case, adequately funded education in the city of Chicago. So now he and the Board of Education at the city of Chicago have to find ways to plug those holes because the state isn't doing its job equitably as it funds the money. And remember, 90% of the students in Chicago are of color, with 38% being African-American and about 47% being Latino. So our brown and brother sisters are getting shortchanged. As I say, our children are second to none, and we deserve the same quality education as anyone else, whether we live in Oak Park or Winnetka, where the governor lives.
Let me challenge you on that. In 1993, then Mayor Daley went to Springfield and he asked for total control of CPS, and he granted total control of CPS. So it is under the mayor's jurisdiction to have full control. Mayor Rahm Emanuel has full control over that. That's why you see a lot of them in decision-making realms.
Well, I think when you say full control, I think what the mayor was asking at that time was asking that the city of Chicago have the right to manage its own educational system like everybody else does. Having full control has nothing to do with having funding. Funding and control are two different things. The state of Illinois is required.
But he has, not to interrupt, but he has a say-so, though.
What do you mean he has a say-so?
He has a say-so. If he has some control, he has some type of say-so.
And what?
And how the money should be dispersed. What type of schools is closing. Even though he's appointing board members. So they having backdoor meetings. So no matter what, it could be he has some type of say-so.
Well, I think we don't want to get this confused because I think that's what happened. Control just means the mayor has the responsibility to ensure that the citizens of Chicago's children get the best quality education that can be provided to them. As for the funding of that education, that is the responsibility of the state of Illinois. Those are two different things. So one is control of the system. The other one is the funding. He has no control over the funding. Therefore, that's why there was a lawsuit, because the lawsuit was one where 5 families, and this is where a lot of confusion happens. Everybody pretends like the mayor name was not on the lawsuit anywhere. It was 5 families and the Chicago Board of Education that filed a lawsuit against the state of Illinois, the governor, and the Illinois State Board of Education because of the discriminatory funding system that's in place where African-American students and Latino students are shortchanged. Once again, our children are second to none. They should be funded as if they're just as good as any other children in the state of Illinois. So it gets down to funding versus control. Don't get the two confused because they are different. Control has nothing to do with the funding. Funding is the responsibility of the state of Illinois per the Constitution of the state of Illinois.
Mr. Lilly, bringing you into the conversation, you have the head of an after-school program. Money is the key. You have a lot of African-American students that you oversee. What is your response?
Yes, we have 99% of our mentees are African-American. My response to that is, I don't know whose responsibility it is. So, I have to take your word for it.
I wouldn't mislead you.
And I believe that. We help students get to college, regardless of where they go to school. We find the college that best fit them. So regardless of what education they get in high school, we find a college for them. That's our concern. That's our purpose.
But money is an issue.
Oh, yes. Money is definitely an issue. Funding is a concern. We're funded by working class people, foundations, corporations. We haven't been funded by the state or city.
Which is hard to come by.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it is.
So how you keep afloat?
Foundations, individuals, giving, corporations. Yep. So we've been afloat. That's not by the city or state.
The Illinois State Lottery was supposed to assist in funding public education as well as after-school programs. Less than 5% has gone to public education in the state of Illinois. Why revenue is going to other state matters instead of public education? You guys filed a lawsuit in after-school programs in the state of Illinois. You guys filed a lawsuit. Why there's no type of ended lawsuit like this money supposed to be for this purpose only? James R. Thompson designed and said, okay, we're going to have the Illinois State Lottery is supposed to specifically for education. Why that's not happening now? Less than 5%.
Well, let's be honest. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this. This is what we call bait and switch.
No, I don't.
And the
I'm
reality,
just kidding.
that's okay. Whether you are or not, the whole point is that the reality is that in order to get the lottery push, it was tied to education. And so what happened is that they funnel the money through general revenue sources, which means that money can go anywhere the legislators see fit at the time that they see fit to take it from education and put it somewhere else. If we want funding from the lottery to go towards the education, then the responsibility is on us as citizens to encourage our legislators to do what the law was intended or what we were promised with the lottery. We get the legislators to do their jobs. Therefore, then we will probably get what we need in terms of funding resources for both education from the lottery, but also the legislator is just as responsible as the governor to make sure that the state funds public education across the board fairly and equitably, whether you be black, white, or brown. That's the bottom line.
In essence, you're saying there should be some type of legislation to prevent Illinois lawmakers from taking majority of public education revenue from the state Illinois State Lottery.
Yeah, here's the bottom line. We were told if we get this lottery money, it would be used to help subsidize public education. That hasn't happened. If that's what the intent of the law was, we need to make sure that the legislators go back and make that become law and it sticks And that's the way that money can only be used. Until that happens, they're free to do what they want with that money, and they have. And they will continue until we say to our legislators, what happened to the lottery money? Make the lottery money be used for what it was meant to be used, which is to support public education.
Mr. Lilly, you're ahead of the after-school program, college mentoring experience. You said funding is an issue. Illinois State Lottery is a huge cash cow. However, less than 5%. He said maybe we should have some type of legislation. What do you think?
I totally agree. Not an after-school program, we're a mentoring program.
Oh, mentoring.
Yeah, mentoring.
I'm
yes.
sorry about that.
One-on-one mentorship where we match a mentor with mentees. We have over 50 matches in our program. Also, we do group mentorship as well.
So you just agree?
I agree.
So why you agree?
With legislation?
Yeah.
I mean, something has to be done. They're not doing what they said they would do. So we need a legislation to carry it out or to do something with it because they're not doing, it's not working.
And let me add that if I promise you something and I give you, and the reason and the promise was, if you support this, we're going to do X, Y, Z, and I don't follow through, then I basically have, like I said, bait and switch or lied to you. So I don't find that your word is something that I can trust. So therefore, I need legislation to back up what you promised me to ensure that the money that are taken from the lottery is used the way it ought to be used, which is for public education. Since you promised that you were going to do it and you didn't, then I need something a little more solid to get that money where it's supposed to get, and that would be some form of legislation. We have a legislative body of state reps and senators that we need to call and ask them to do the right thing, not only just with that issue, but also with the funding of public education. We need to call our state senators, our state reps, as well as the governor. This issue of funding is on the back of the governor and the legislator now. Legislation. We cannot let this go by, and we cannot let this pass. We need to let everybody know that they are accountable for funding public education as required by the Constitution of Illinois.
How does the revenue shortage in public education affect programs in the African American community? I'm going to start with you, Mr. Lilly. Your program is affected.
Yes.
The shortage in revenue is always needed. So what is your opinion on the effects of the shortage, the funding shortage, what Ron Lawless explained?
Well, usually after school programs, mentoring programs is usually the first one being cut when the funding is short. You know, if they give the funding what's needed, and then if they do what they say if they do what they said they would do with the funding, of course, the schools could do more and we'll get a better education and the students would be more prepared for college. Right now, a lot of our children are not really prepared for college. But if they get the funding that they need, that would help.
Can you define they're not prepared in what way because of the shortage of funding?
Well, because of whatever the dollars is, I don't know the amount of per student that CPS get, but it's not the same as Winnetka, or New Trier. So we need to get more money for funding per student. And if we got that the educators could do a better job.
And there goes my argument, is that CPS students are receiving less money than other students in other school districts, even though we have 20% of the population, but we receive only 15%. Plus, we pay for our own pension, where other school district pensions are paid for by the state. Also, keep in mind that the governor, after both the House and the Senate passed $215 million to help with CPS funding, he vetoed that bill. And he vetoed that bill with the stipulation because he's using a ransom. He's using ransom to get what he wants, which is his legislation agenda push at the expense of our children. Our children should not be held hostage. They should not be put up for ransom for what the state is required to do by law. If the governor has political agendas and policies that he's interested in, he needs to take that up in the appropriate framework of government. But do not use the children of Chicago as ransom to get what you want, because our kids deserve the best education as anyone else. Let's take Winnetka, where the governor lives. Even if we took the funding that the state provides to each district and never gave any of those dollars to the city or village of Winnetka, the village of Winnetka would still be okay because of the high property taxes. That's another issue that needs to be confronted, that the property taxes of districts have a lot to do with how much money will be given to a student per student in their community. In Winnetka, they have Olympic-sized swimming pools. In Chicago, we don't have those. So we talk about the students that go to Harvard. If I'm getting $50,000 a year per student, I guess I can be equipped to go to Harvard. That's not to say that our students aren't doing well, because 7 of the top 10 schools in Chicago, even though they're not being funded equitably, are the top 7 high schools out of the top 10. So we are still doing a great job, even with the lack of funding that we deserve. Just think, if we got all the funding, how better we can do with our schools and our students.
What are the schools? You mentioned 5. What are the schools?
Well, I don't know them all top offhand, but you have Whitney Young, you have Walter Payton, you have I think Lane Tech is one of them. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but those are the 2 main ones that I can think of right now. But we have 7 of the 10 top schools in the city, in the state, that are outranking the rest of the state, and that's with less money. Just think, if they gave us the full amount of money as required by law, we could really be knocking the ball out of the ballpark.
You mentioned earlier about legislators.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go a little bit further and talk about African-American legislation, or the Black Caucus.
Mm-hmm.
The Black Caucus, you can't get anything passed without the votes and support of the Black Caucus.
Okay.
The key component of that is why they are allowing this to go on and continuing to go on, knowing that it affects their district.
Look, I've always said, you have to make elected officials accountable. If they don't feel that they're accountable, they may not do the job that they go down to Springfield to do. I'm telling people, and parents and CPS are saying, look, if elected officials are not going to represent us on election day, we're going to be busy voting for someone else other than them. And so we won't have to worry about whether they're doing anything or not, because we're going to find people who are going to do what we want them to do. If you are asking for our votes, then we expect something in return for our vote. And what we expect from that vote is representation. If you cannot represent our interests, our concerns, one of the interests that we want you to represent right now is to figure out a way to make the educational funding for the state of Illinois equitable for all children, especially for those children in the city of Chicago that look like me, and those Latino brothers and sisters that are also impacted by this discriminatory practice of funding.
Do you feel like it's discriminatory, Mr. Lilly? Do you feel like the practice in allocating funds is discriminatory?
Well, the numbers don't lie. You know, they speak for themselves. So it's really not about how I feel. It's about the facts.
Period.
So
how would it affect your students?
It affects my student. I mean, they can do a much better job if they got the funding. They will be, I mean, there are schools with, as he said, that are not funded the way they should, but are performing well. But all the other schools that's not performing well, if they had the funding, they would be doing much better. The students can benefit more if they got the funding.
And Chicago has some of the best schools in the whole state. Let's get that clear. I think that we always want to label Chicago as the trouble district. It's no more trouble than anywhere else. Sure. And the bottom line is that our kids in those schools are doing well under some extreme circumstances. So when you shortchange our children funding, you do a lot of damage, not only to the student, but you do a lot of damage to that community. Those children are doing the best that they can under the circumstances that they're faced with each and every day that they walk through the door. To be honest with you, I give the district a lot of kudos for doing its best under the circumstances that it's faced with right now. They have no control over the fact that the state is not doing its job. If they make cuts, it's not because they want to make the cuts. They're forced to make these cuts because they still. But here's the thing: their cuts are not made to impact the students in the classroom. They work very hard to ensure that those cuts do not work their way into the classroom. That does not necessarily always mean that's not going to happen. But the reality is that we shouldn't even be talking about cuts. We should be talking about our schools are flourishing and they're being successful. And guess what? They're being funded the way they're supposed to be funded because the law says in the Illinois Constitution that it is the responsibility of the state to fund public education. Governor Rauner and the state legislators need to do their job and do it now and not later, because right now, while our students are still in school and they're going to be in school, they're still faced with the fact that there is going to be a shortchange of dollars or a shortage of dollars that are still going to be there because the district may still have to do some cuts where they may not want to, but in order to keep those doors open, the money has to come from somewhere.
You mentioned they need to do their job. Earlier, you talked about forcing them to do their job. Well, imagine I'm a senator or a legislator, House of Representative. I got the votes. So what? What you say to that?
Well, when you say you have the votes, and so what?
I have the votes to keep me elected.
Okay.
You're one vote. How can I? You're the masses. How can you force the masses to force that senator, force that legislator? This is important here.
Well, I would hope that legislator is not that foolish to think that he has the vote.
I can pinpoint you several legislators
they may think that now, but I can tell you one thing. After the court ruling last Friday, the parents were very upset. And as one parent said, our eyes are open. We are awakened and we are a force to be reckoned with. We are going to mobilize, we're going to organize, and we're going to make our voices be heard. So maybe they thought they had those votes, but I can guarantee you now, they better be very careful because those votes may not be there, because now you are talking about children. You're talking about people's children. You're not talking about something that is not as directly impacting their life, but this is impacting their life directly. So I would be very careful for any elected official, including the governor, to think that we are going to be a sleeping giant. This is a very important issue to us. We want to be funded. We want our kids to go to school without having to worry about if their school year is going to be cut. We want the state to do the job that is required to do under the Constitution, which is to fund our schools equitably. As I said, CPS is 20% of the district of the state population, but yet it receives only 15%. And we also have to pay our own pension, versus where the rest of the school districts in the state are being funded for their pension by the state of Illinois through state taxes. So we need to change some things, both how we fund pensions and how we fund public education for students throughout the state of Illinois.
Mr. Lilly, I'm a state legislator now. Okay, so what? Well, you're one vote. You're 20 votes. So what? I got 1,000 in my pocket here. How can you change your mind? Last time you was here, when you was here this time last year, you was talking about it's kind of hard to get parents to mobilize on a single issue. I'm popping my collar and I'm saying, and?
Well, that's sad that some of the legislators feel that way. They just need to do the right thing. If they do the right thing, everybody wins. Especially, it's about the students when it comes to education. If they do the right thing, students win, and that's really what it's all about.
If they want to take that Maria Antoinette attitude, let them eat cake. We will eat cake, but while we're eating cake, we will be taking care of business on Election Day. And on Election Day, we will be voting for individuals who represent us, and then you will eat the cake. So if they're that arrogant, I would advise them to become unarrogant and to start to focus on this issue, which is funding the public educational system the way it was meant to be funded, and to start working with the district of CPS and the parents, and ensuring that next year our children do not have to go through this cycle that we had to go through this past year. It's unfair to our children, it's unfair to the parents, and most importantly, it's unfair to the taxpayers of the city of Chicago.
Are we going backwards to the days of segregation? separating whites and blacks in education. The reason I'm saying this because in education, African American programs and schools are the first ones to get cut. Your opinions on that? Because let me put it this way. They don't cut programs in Winnetka, in Skokie. Come on. In Oak Park. You get a little tit and a tat, and they're fuming over that little tit and a tat. But are we moving back to the days of segregation?
Well, that was the whole purpose of the lawsuit, is to say, look, because of the inequitable funding system in place, it puts a bigger burden on those school districts, especially like Chicago, where the majority of the students are Black and Latino. When we talk about Oak Park, we talk about Winnetka, the majority of those students are white. And that was our argument in our court case, is that white students don't seem to face these challenges because not only do they receive more dollars than children in CPS, but they also have the wherewithal with their tax base to subsidize the difference. So now, if I'm giving you, let's say, $2,000 per student, but in Winnetka, we're going to add another $10,000 to that. Now I have $12,000 versus $2,000. Where in Chicago, we may say we're going to raise our taxes to give $3,000 extra, which now makes our students get $5,000. There's still a $7,000 gap. So no matter how you look at it, there will always continue to be a gap as long as we depend on property taxes to fund public education. If you live in a rich district, I'll give you a good example. Oak Brook. Oak Brook does not have to worry about property taxes because they got that big mall that you go out and shop to. And when you shop at that mall, you're funding their children's education. So at the same time, you're doing two things. You're funding their public education and you're funding yours here in Chicago. But at the end of the day, they're able to take the difference of what they need to ensure their children get the best quality education by adding their tax base, their property tax base, by increasing their taxes to subsidize the difference of what they feel they need to ensure that their child get a quality education. And all we're asking in Chicago is just give us a chance to be on the same even playing field. And let me say this, even with all that additional money that they're getting, our CPS schools are still outranking them.
Again, Mr. Lilly, you see these children every single day, and you look at those faces, and sometimes you see, like, programs are not there. They're not college bound. They're not college ready. What type of program should Chicago Public School implement to make them college ready?
Well,
that they cut. I'm sorry.
That they cut.
That they cut.
I'm not sure what they cut. I'm not familiar with that area. What I'm familiar with is matching them with a mentor, giving them the guidance that they need, and finding them a college that best fit them. That's what I'm familiar with. So that part of it, what has been cut, what they cut, I think he's the expert.
Well, let me say this, Roman. Let me say this, Roman. Let me say this quickly, Roman.
Go ahead.
The cuts would not be cuts if the state does its job, which is fund public education equitably. See, I don't want this conversation to get lost on cuts. Cuts are detrimental to public education, especially at CPS, because, as I said, our school system serves a bigger need than the school systems in other parts of the state. We are a place where students can come for breakfast, after school program, and mentoring services, and so on and so forth. But when we talk about cuts, let's talk about the root of the cut. The cuts are because we're not being funded equitably by the state. The governor is holding our children ransom when he can easily have signed that bill. And now he's saying if the system, the CPS district, and the mayor supports his budget, then they can get the money that they deserve. What kind of craziness is that? Why do I have to do XYZ for you to do what you're supposed to do by law? I'm entitled to the money based on the Constitution, and I shouldn't have to do XYZ to get that money. It's like me saying to you, you need to work an extra couple of hours so I can pay you what you think you're worth, or pay you your salary for 40 hours. But I want you to give me 2 extra hours, but you're not going to get paid for it.
on Friday, Mayor Rahm Emanuel used this term, colored people, to address African Americans as well as Hispanics to respond to the judge's decision on shortening the school year. He was not the only public official to use that terminology. Recently, my question again, public officials using terms in the 50s, in the 60s, should we be concerned that public officials are resorting to using phrases like colored people, referring to African Americans to address our issues? It's not just Rahm Emanuel that used colored people. A couple of moments ago, you said color. Are we going back to the ages? I mean, are we going to be forced, since Donald Trump, and I'm sorry to go on a tangent here, are we going to be called Negro again? Are we going to call nigger again? Because that term, to me, saying colored and using education, that terminology, what happened to minority? I've taught this over several times to people, and they're saying, no, they call white women minorities. So I'm kind of dumbfounded that are we going to be starting addressing African American issues as colored people like back in the day?
Well, I can't say what the mayor may have said because I didn't hear it. But when you said that I used the word color, I'm saying people of color who tend to be people like me, Black and Latino. And yes, white women are included in the minority, but I think that when we talk about defining, and we're going to not but we're going to aggregate these numbers with regards to who's whom. In this case, when it comes to public education in the city of Chicago, it is the 47% of Latinos and the 39% of Blacks that are impacted the most by public education in the city of Chicago. So they happen to be people of color. So therefore, I don't think there's anything.
But why we can't, sorry to interrupt, why we can't use Black or brown issues? I mean, that's less of a blow saying, okay, people of color.
Well, here's the thing. I don't want us to lose focus on
the
terminology when the real issue is not whether the mayor said color or not. The real issue, and the mayor was probably very emotional, and he should have been, because once again, it is his responsibility as the mayor of Chicago to protect the interests of the citizens of Chicago, and especially protect the interests of those students who he knows need the most support of any of the students outside of Chicago because of the fact of the hardships and the circumstances that they are living under. The reality is of this situation is it's all about funding. Let's not lose the focus here. Funding, equitable funding. If we're not having equitable funding, the bottom line is we all hurt, whether we be Black, brown, or white. Citizens in Chicago are not all brown. They're not all Black. They are whites, and they also are impacted by this. So we need to address the funding issue and stay focused on the funding issue and get the governor and the legislators in Springfield to do their job, which is to release the funds to ensure that public education in the city of Chicago is getting the dollars it needs to do the job that is required to do. And at the end of the day, don't hold our kids ransom for what you want your political agenda to be. Your political agenda is your political agenda. It's not my political agenda. All I'm concerned about is ensuring that children of color be given the necessary dollars for education.
You're going to keep using that terminology.
Which terminology is that?
Color.
People of color. You don't like it, but once again.
But
okay, I will go with you with Latinos and African-American children. I'll stick with that term.
Okay, thank you. What I'm saying is a respect issue.
Okay,
and in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, because if you sit there and say colored, knowing where that terminology, back in the past, I wasn't there, but I know my ancestors was there, and that term hurt people. It's just like the recording industry using the N-word. I mean, sometimes you got to draw the line and say, hey, wait a second here. We called a lot of things, but you using the term color, that's kind of out of line. You could have used minority, Black or brown issue or something like that.
Look, Roman, I personally use the word, I don't have a problem with it. What I have a problem with It's the lack of funding of our children education. That's what really is the issue for me, more than me being called color or whatever. Because at the end of the day, if those children that you're referring to aren't getting a proper education, everything that you just mentioned about them being called other names will become true, because they're not getting the proper education that they should be getting. These children, we need to focus on what the real issue is. Whether the mayor said what you think he said or did say, I don't know. All I know is I'm focused on where our parents are focused on, which is getting the governor and getting the state representatives to do the job of funding public education as it ought to be funded, to ensure that we don't keep going through this cycle year in and year out. We cannot continue to do this with the city of Chicago. Our children need to know, and our parents need to know, that when they send their kids to school, that they don't have to worry about is the school year going to be shortened because there's not enough money.
I still think it's a respect issue.
Okay, you can have that.
According to, well, let me clarify. When you have that respect, I think you'll get what you want in funding. It goes back to, a lot of people say you got to earn your respect. And in order to get respect, you must have respect. And if the mayor is getting caught saying colored, and to me, it's kind of like, okay, if I can get away with this, what else I can get away with? So that's not to respond. That was rhetorical.
Okay.
According to the Chicago Tribune, graduation rate among African-American women is at 76%. African-American males, 76% for African-American women, African-American males, 57%. Why African-American women are much higher than males in graduation? I'll start with you, Mr. Lilly.
That's a good question. I don't have the answer, but I do have I don't know why. I don't know the reason, but I do have a solution.
What is the solution?
College mentoring experience. You get in our program, we're going to make sure you graduate. Bottom line.
And what direction? Can you explain a little bit about college mentoring experience?
Well, one, we match every student up with a adult. That's gonna the biggest part of college mentoring experience is education, mentoring them through their journey through middle school. We start with middle school, so 6th grade through college. So we mentor them through middle school, high school, and through college. And we make sure, one, that they graduate. 2, that they get accepted at a college or university. 3, while they're there, that they do well there. 4, that they graduate. And they know, the ones who come through our program, that they're not just there for a degree, they're there for their career when they go to college. So, but we're going to make sure that the graduation go up, because we're going to make sure all of our students graduate high school.
Go ahead. I'm going to unleash the leash here. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, and I'm going to continue to say this because this, I believe, is the true factor. It all comes down to economics, dollars and cents. Mm-hmm. Funding. If the state does its job in funding our educational system in the proper manner that is ought to, based on the Constitution, we can have the kind of programs that give me your first name again. Bernard is referring to. And we can have more programs, and we can support. So it all gets back to funding. If we really want to solve a lot of our problems, including violence and other activities that we consider to be activities that create problems for our community, start to fund our educational system. It's better to get our children on the front end, because one way or the other, you're going to pay. Absolutely. You either pay on the front end or you pay on the back end. By paying on the front end, you have a chance of having a productive citizen who is going to give back to the community, pay taxes, and be a good voice for the community, but also a good voice for public education to say, look, I am a product of CPS, and thank God that I was able to get a good quality education. And I will be able to say in the background, that's because we guaranteed you got equitable funding for your education, because we made the state and the governor do their job.
Mr. Lilly, you talk to some youth and they will say in today's society it's much harder to just go to school and learn. They have to worry about gangs, sex, and experimentation. In your opinion, why African-American children, especially males, feel pressure in attending public schools? Why they feel pressure? Because some people that I have talked to, they said they closed the school which you mentioned, Mr. Lawless, they closed the school down. So they have to walk through gang territory or bypass that, which district, people in the district that makes these decisions, not even concerned about. Your response?
Well, two things. One is, it goes back to funding, which I agree with the brother. If we get the proper funding, get jobs, a lot of things would change. I think with a lack of funding, it creates this violence. It creates other things, people doing with the lack of funding, lack of jobs. With those things, it create the negativity, the violence, the guns. It create all of this. But if we get the proper funding, all of this stuff, I believe, could go away or decrease tremendously.
So it gets back to what we said at the beginning of the outset of the show. Fund the schools, especially CPS, equitably as required by the Constitution, and do not use our children as ransom to hold up that funding because you have another political agenda that you're trying to get pushed, and you're going to use our kids as ransom so you can get that agenda pushed. We're saying to the governor, no more. You're not going to use our kids. They're not going to be your ransom, and you're going to fund education because we are getting ready to organize and mobilize like never before because CPS is not alone in this fight. The parents have awakened. People like me, community activists, we are awakened. We're saying to both legislators, Black and Latinos, and everybody else, and Republicans, we are getting a calling card and we're going to take notes and we're taking names. And if we have to on election day, if you can't do what we need you to do right now, we will elect people who can, and we won't have to worry about this anymore.
I'm going to jump off subject and tie it in.
Okay.
The missing 16-month-old Joliet child, which was found dead, we still don't know the full details. However, a lot of people are suspecting that the mother and the family had something to do with it. Do you think this situation, if they had a mentor, she had some guidance? We mentioned, again, proper funding, proper education. Parenting classes has been cut. Home economics, cut. And I'm sorry to go this way, and I know women are going to look at me funny. You have women out there that choose Popeye's chicken as an everyday ritual to get something to eat. They don't know how to make a meal. They don't know how to cook. They don't know how to sew. They don't know these things. Males, same thing. You have wood shop. You have all these things. Do you think the cutting, which Ron Lawless keep on emphasizing, funding. This is a tragic situation. You said earlier, avoiding tragic situation like this, we need to start funding. You mentor some of these people. You provide outlets. Can you describe the importance of parenting classes and mentorships and so forth and so on, which you do on a daily basis?
Yes, I think it's so important. I think every child needs a mentor in their life. Because every child don't tell their parent everything. They need somebody else, a listening ear for them, and to partner. It takes a village to raise, and the mentors are part of that village. And we need mentors. We need every student with mentors to help guide them through their journey because it's not easy for them. But we know that with that extra person pushing them, encouraging them, telling them they can make it, they are going to be successful, and giving them hope. Because the children that have hope, they're not the one picking up guns. The children that have hope, they're not the one that is creating the violence. So having a mentor give these children the hope they need, the encouragement they need, the guidance they need, and the push that they need to be successful in life.
Want to respond?
Yeah, I'm going to just say that even with the lack of funding, CPS is still providing parenting programs. We have parent universities, and they have other programs that are offered in the school. And even with the after-school programs with Century 21, they have parenting programs tied into those programs. So parenting is a very important part of the educational system. I think studies have shown parents that are involved in a child's education are more likely to be more successful.
Yes.
But mentors are important too. I come from a single parent household. It was mentors who were there for me, and they were male mentors. And without them, I don't know what type of path I would have taken. But I do know this. I'm following in their footsteps by going out there and advocating on behalf of parents, as well as for a school district that's being shortchanged because the majority of their students are African Americans and Latino. And I think that we all have a responsibility.
You're going to keep that rubbing in my face. That terminology.
I think we all have a responsibility to step up where we can step up when we see wrong. When you have a governor that is using our children as a ransom, we have a responsibility to say to that governor, oh no, you're not going to do that to our kids. You're going to do what is right by our kids by funding public education and changing whatever formula system that needs to be changed for both pensions and funding public education. You need to do it now. And no longer are you going to use our children as a means for other political agendas that you have. No, not anymore, because then you are treating me like I'm color. So I don't want to be called color. I'm going to not let you treat me like color, and you will acknowledge me as an African American and Latino.
Last week, we had Chairman Fred Hampton on the show. Here is what he said. We should consider our own. I am going to throw this question out at you and rephrase the question. Should leaders and educators in the African-American community should consider educating and or creating a school system of our own? Starting with you, Mr. Lilly.
What do you mean by our own?
Meaning that we educate our own children. We start our own school system in the African-American community. Like you have the college mentoring experience, and you hook them up with mentors. Mm-hmm. Educating, we have a lot of educators in the African-American community.
Yes.
Why we can't teach our own? Why we can't start our own school system?
I mean, I think we can. I think that's possible. You know, whether that's the way to go, it's just a matter of opinion. I think if we get going back to funding again, I think that if we get the funding that we need, our children would be properly educated, regardless of who educates them.
Look, I'm not in any way in support of any discrimination or segregation. To me, that would be just what that would be: discrimination and segregation. The reality is, as Mr. Bernard said, if we properly fund our schools, it doesn't make a difference who's teaching them. They're getting the necessary resources to be educated. I don't want to go back and what makes you think because they're going to be educated by blacks or by Latinos that they're going to get a better education? There's no guarantee to that. The reality is that we have a system in place. The governor and the legislators need to fund it, and they need to fund it now and need to move on to something else, whatever else they need to move on, but they need to focus on this and get this out the way. That's all. And if we do that, we don't have to worry about who's educating our kids, because they'll be getting the quality education they deserve because the funding is there. Resources is key. If you don't have the resources, it doesn't make a difference who's educating.
That's true.
You got to have the resources, and that's what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the same resources that everybody else is getting, and they're getting it through the state. As I said, we're 20% of the population. We only get 15%. The governor and the state legislators just need to do their jobs.
What would be a good solution besides funding for education? What would be a good solution? Let's leave here on solutions. Okay. I'm a legislator. I don't have, my hands are tied in Springfield. I don't have the necessary votes from my colleagues in there. So what solutions would you give to the people on Intellectual Radio who's listening to intellectualradio.com/iHeart radio station? A good solution and scenario for getting this done, education resolve, funding wise?
Well, a couple of things they can do. They can go to savecpsschools.com and they can join by signing our petition asking that the governor release the $215 million so our children can get the education that they so deserve without CPS having to cut any more money than it has to talk to 3 or 5 of their neighbors and friends and say, look, this is an issue that not only impacts the people that have children in CPS, but it impacts us all because our taxes and other fees might be imposed on us because we're not getting the proper funding from the state that we're required by the Constitution. Also put images on of videos of what it looks like by not having proper funding, tattered books, classrooms that walls or paint is falling from. Also, call your legislators. Ask that your legislators get off their duff and do the job that they have been elected to do. Go and find whatever necessary votes you need to find. And if you need us, call us to call your legislators and other legislators to say, look, we are standing behind this issue. We want you to vote on it. We want you to fund our education. So those are just some of the things that the people can do. Continue to mobilize, continue to have rallies, continue to have the conversation, call into radio stations like yours, get the message out that this is unacceptable, and we're going to do whatever it takes to ensure that this is not an annual cycle of us having to ask for more money to keep our schools open. We want to be able to say our schools are being funded as they are as they are required and as they should be, and not have to worry about whether or not we have enough money to keep them open. So people need to organize, mobilize, and once again, savecpsschools.com.
Mr. Lilly?
I mean, I agree with everything he said, but I it's hard to give an answer without putting funding in it, because that's going to be, I mean, that's the solution to a lot of the problems. I mean, if we had funding, we wouldn't have a lot of problems that we have, or issues and challenges that we have. So, you know, if we get it, let's talk about getting the funding, and then we'll deal with those set of issues or challenges that we have then. But let's get the funding first.
And you can't have this radio show without some funding. So you know how important. Let's talk about it realistically. So you know funding is important. So I'm saying what you already know. Fund my schools and we'll be okay. CPS needs to be funded equitably. Bottom line.
Mr. Lilly, you have an event coming up. Please tell intellectualradio.com/iHeartRadio listeners what's the event.
I am so excited to announce on the Drive at 5 that College Mentoring Experience is having our 2nd annual fundraising at Malcolm X College, May 20th. Social Mixer is at 6 p.m. and the program will start at 7:30 p.m. So excited. That is a Saturday, May 20th.